I'm the Curator of Natural History, or Senior Curator of Natural History at Canterbury Museum. And my work over the last 23, 24 years has been to use the collections of Canterbury Museum and to also collect items from primarily New Zealand, which give us information about how New Zealand animals primarily have evolved over millennia, over the last 60 or 70 million years. And one of my primary areas of interest is in the New Zealand Miocene. So the New Zealand Miocene, or the Miocene period, was a period from about 20 million years ago to about 6 million years ago. And it was a pivotal period in defining what animals and plants are found in the world today. And it's a period that is rather different, both weather-wise and even position-wise, for many parts of the world. So the talk that I'm giving today is what was New Zealand like 16 million years ago. But effectively what I'm talking about in general is what the New Zealand land, fauna and flora was like during this Miocene period. As I'm sure most of us are aware, New Zealand occupies a special position in the world because of the fact that we separated from the supercontinent of Gondwana between 60 or 70 million years ago and 50 million years ago. This process is still ongoing due to a rift in the continent and the crust in the middle of the Tasman Sea. And New Zealand drifted away really quite slowly as this rift became established between Australia and Antarctica and the piece of crust which New Zealand is on. The coastline that you can see there, marked in black, is the familiar coastline that we all know of for New Zealand today. But as you can see from that diagram, the coastline was in a slightly different position than it is today. And that's effectively because of all the the land movements that have gone on since that period 70 million years ago. You can see where we are on Banks Peninsula and the Canterbury region there was actually quite significantly offset from the rest of New Zealand. And the piece of land that you can see spreading down to the southwest there is that Chatham Rise, which is also very significant for our understanding of New Zealand's flora and fauna, because in fact the Chathams were connected to New Zealand for quite a long period of time. Although there were a huge number of animals and plants on New Zealand, probably when it drifted away from the supercontinent of Gondwana, about 25 million years ago, a really quite catastrophic event occurred, which is known as the Oligocene high stand, or the Oligocene drowning. And this was a period where due to both tectonic forces and also due to rising sea level, the land which makes up New Zealand today was almost completely drowned. When this phenomena was first discovered, it was actually even suspected that the entire landmass of New Zealand may have been drowned. But we now suspect that in fact small pieces of land, that only quite small islands survived across the whole extent of land that is now New Zealand today. There was a small piece of land in the Southland area and maybe a few islands in between, and a larger piece of land in the Northland area. And all the animals and plants that were on the piece of land that was New Zealand when it drifted apart from Antarctica and Australia. The only representatives of that flora and fauna are the ones that were actually on those pieces of land. And that was really quite a catastrophic event that probably caused the extinction of many of our iconic animals that we don't even know what they were. But clearly a few representatives of that iconic flora and fauna actually survived. But many of those icons are not the icons that we once believed. For example, there was a famous botanist in the 1970s and 80s on TV, Dr. David Bellamy, and he had a TV series on the BBC, I think it was, that talked about New Zealand as being Noah's Ark. Just a clever play on words from Noah, of course. But the idea of Noah's Ark was that it was a piece of land that drifted away from Gondwana and had all these bizarre animals that used to be on Gondwana, but in fact became extinct on Australia and of course Antarctica and the other parts of Gondwana. And these animals and plants only survived in New Zealand. Using both the fossil record and DNA evidence, we now learn that many of what we thought were these iconic New Zealand relics are in fact probably quite recent blow-ins, because DNA evidence gives you the opportunity to actually date the time that two animals split or two plants split from each other based on the amount of DNA that they actually differ by. If we assume that DNA actually has a set rate of mutation, then you can actually use a set rate of mutation to actually calculate how different two animals or two plants are. So for example, a classic case in New Zealand is that we thought that moa, the giant extinct birds of New Zealand, were part of this vicariant fauna, this fauna that was actually on Noah's Ark as it drifted away. But using this technique of DNA dating, we actually determined that the split between the moa and its nearest relatives in South America was probably only about 40 or 50 million years ago, and probably post-dates the time that New Zealand had already drifted from Gondwana, suggesting that the relatives of moa, the iconic, I guess, example of Noah's Ark, didn't drift away on Noah's Ark, but actually their earliest relatives actually flew to New Zealand. And this really quite fundamentally upends our idea of New Zealand as a relictual place where odd animals and plants actually survived cataclysmic events elsewhere, and really gives us much more of an idea that New Zealand was somewhere where, I guess much like us as humans, we've blown from all around the world to get here and just decided it was a good place to live. And that's something that's only happened comparatively recently in geological terms. So there have been a number of papers that have discussed and in the way that science works, have taken the Noah's Ark hypothesis, the idea that New Zealand was this place where relic species lived, and actually looked at all the evidence using DNA and the fossil record, and somewhat debunked this idea of Noah's Ark. So what do we really know about the Miocene, which was a really important period in the evolution of New Zealand's flora and fauna, and unfortunately one of the only periods of time that we have in the last 60 million years where we have a reasonable idea of what animals and plants lived on the land of New Zealand. So what we definitely know for sure is that New Zealand during this period was much warmer and drier. And throughout the world, a number of studies have been used, a number of methods have been used to establish temperature. And in New Zealand, we've also looked at rainfall. And I won't go into the specifics of how this has been calculated, but if you look at the yellow and indeed the blue lines there, and if you look from the right going to the left, so at the right we have 31 million years and at the left we have 7 million years. So this is the period of the Oligocene and then the Miocene. If you look at, say, the orange or yellow graph there, that is effectively a proxy for temperature. And that proxy for temperature is supported by the blue line there, which is another proxy, suggesting that the temperature in the earliest part of the Miocene, about 16 million years ago, was much, much higher than it is today. And by New Zealand standards, by South Island standards, that could have been 10 or 11 degrees warmer, the average annual temperature. And effectively what has been happening since what's known as the mid-Miocene climatic optimum, the MMCO, is that temperature has been effectively declining up until especially this period about 6 million years ago, when things became very complicated, because then we had a period of severe glaciation worldwide. But effectively, New Zealand in the last 60 million years has never been warmer than it was during this mid-Miocene climatic optimum, and it probably was a period where the world was actually, when New Zealand would have had the type of climate that we all dream about when we're going on holiday, but some other parts of the world, in particular the tropics, would have been, really quite unpleasant for human life, and from a worldwide perspective, New Zealand probably had that ideal holiday climate. Really quite different from the places that I'll be talking about today, which are primarily in the Central Otago region. And we have a very rich marine fossil record, not just from the Miocene, but also from the Oligocene and the Eocene, which is telling us a pretty remarkable story about the role that New Zealand played, especially in the evolution of the marine mammals. And not to dive into it too deeply, but in North Canterbury we have remarkable fossil seals, most closely related to those that are now found only in the tropics of places like the Mediterranean and Hawaii, the monk seals. We have a really rich dolphin fauna that has been found primarily from North Canterbury and from North Otago. A tiny group of dolphins internationally extinct now, known as the Kentriodontids. We've got really incredible fossil evidence for the evolution of the baleen whales. We've got incredible evidence for the evolution of bizarre toothed dolphins, which are also from groups that are totally extinct. And although it isn't my area of study, it is an exceptional, internationally exceptional fossil record, pretty much unsurpassed anywhere in the world. But what I'm primarily going to talk to you about today is understanding what New Zealand's land looked like. And this is a very fragmentary understanding, because effectively we've only got two tiny wee keyholes that we can actually peer through to actually try and understand what the whole of New Zealand was like during this period. And for various geological reasons, these two keyholes are in the Central Otago region. So the St Bathans fauna is in a geological sediment known as the Dunstan Formation, which extends all the way from the Waitaki right down to just south of Queenstown, and it is particularly well exposed at St Bathans and also at Bannockburn. And the other area that we'll talk about is Fulden Maar, which is a remarkable deposit, slightly more inland, slightly more towards the sea from Central Otago. St Bathans is probably most famous for the fact that it has the historic village of St Bathans. And this became established during the gold mining period. The extraction methods for the gold at St Bathans were very destructive. They used water sluicing to get to the base of the alluvial deposits, and that was where the gold had accumulated. And they washed away literally millions and millions of tons of these alluvial deposits to get at the gold in that area. The landscape today is pretty typical of Central Otago today, with these rolling hills, very dry. In the top right-hand corner there, you can actually see some of the gold workings, but the areas that the gold are extracted from and the fossil areas are not terribly, they don't overlap. The primary area that we're working is on the Manuherikia River, just about 4 or 5 kilometres from St Bathans Township. And in the river banks are exposed the clays, the fossil clays from Lake Manuherikia. And Lake Manuherikia was a lake that existed right across Central Otago during the early Miocene. If it was a single lake, and we can't be sure of that at all, then its extent would have been about 5 times the extent of Lake Taupo today. We don't know for sure whether or not it was a single lake. It could have been like a mosaic of lakes, much like, say, northern Minnesota. Hundreds of little lakes basically pot-marking the landscape. And this lake formed as the land rose after the Oligocene high stand. The sea level internationally lowered due to the formation of ice caps, and at the same time there was quite a substantial tectonic uplift on the New Zealand landmass, and both of these features meant that the land in Central Otago went from being solidly underwater in the Oligocene to a lake-covered landscape by 16 to 20 million years ago. And what we're doing is we're finding quite thin layers of bone and shell that were deposited in the bottom of this lake over probably a 5 million year period in the early Miocene. And my co-workers here include Lee Love, famous Waipara fossil collector, Al Mannering, a doyen of New Zealand fossil collectors and by far the greatest preparator of New Zealand fossils, who's been working now with Canterbury Museum for more than 40 years. Myself, and in this photo, Trevor Worthy, who is sometimes known in the New Zealand press as Mr. Moa. He began his career delving into the biology of moa. He's now based in Adelaide at Flinders University in Australia. And what you can see here is once we have exploited a fossil site that we discover at the river bank, we need to follow that very thin layer back underneath the alluvium. This is the alluvium here, back onto farmland. So we're very lucky that we have the support of farmers to actually do this. We do return the farmland to pretty much exactly how it was. This is Ewan Johnson's turnip paddock, and this particular area, which is our most productive particular bed. So we scrape away the alluvium and we get right down to a layer which we define as being the richest layer that we can actually exploit. And this layer is only about 5 to 10 centimetres thick. There are fossils above and below, but when you're looking for bangs for buck, this is the spot that actually really produces the good stuff, the good oil, as we sometimes call it. There's my wife Vanessa standing on top of the layer. And we're finding really quite remarkable things. So when this site was first sort of highlighted as being truly important in the 1980s, the first remarkable fossil they found was a tiny bit of the jaw of a crocodile. And lots of people, well, no one knew that crocodiles had been in New Zealand. Many people are very surprised to discover this even today. And to be honest, we've only found very fragmentary remains. We have hundreds of pieces of bone and pieces of the scutes, those little bumps that you find up and down on them, lots of teeth. But we don't find like complete skeletons. In fact, we don't find complete skeletons of anything at this particular site. And it's really quite frustrating, especially with these crocodiles, how fragmentary the remains actually are. We find almost enough of parts of the skull to describe species, but we still have trouble actually determining what their closest relatives are. So hopefully in the next couple of years we'll really be able to nail down their relatives. We had originally believed, and this work has been spearheaded by Dr. Stephen Salisbury at the University of Queensland. We'd originally believed that these crocodiles were most likely to be related to a group of crocodiles that were in Australia during the Miocene and even till quite recently, up until about 30, 40 million years ago, and became extinct. But this group was primarily terrestrial. And terrestrial crocodiles are something that are really quite stuff of horror stories to humans, as you can imagine. Some terrestrial crocodiles probably were able to outrun humans over short periods of time on the land. They weren't absolutely restricted to waterways and whatever. And there was even a species that became extinct on New Caledonia very shortly after humans arrived there, that they believe may have been not only terrestrial but actually arboreal, and that has given that species the nickname the drop croc. The idea that it may have climbed trees and effectively jumped out of the trees as prey walked along below. It's really the stuff of like bizarre horror movies. And we don't know anything really about the New Zealand crocodile, but in fact the interesting thing that we're now believing is that the New Zealand crocodiles may not have been related to these Australian ones. It might actually be more potentially related to even relictual species that were on Gondwana during the Cretaceous. But unfortunately, the story with this one is watch this space. But some things are very similar to what we have today. And these tiny bones, only about 2 or 3 or less, 5 to 10 millimeters maximum in size, are the ear bones of fish, known as otoliths. And in many cases, otoliths provide the best evidence for fish diversity in the fossil record because they have very distinctive shapes. Each of these 3 photograph series is a particular species in a different group. The top one here on the left-hand side is a member of the whitebait family, and just like today, whitebait and these animals here, which are the gobies, were the 2 commonest native species of fish in Lake Manuherikia, and along with the one on the right there, which is a grayling, these 3 groups dominated in this lake. The interesting thing about them is, unlike whitebait today, these fish were actually the size of trout. Although, of course, obviously their whitebait would have been the same size as whitebait today, they just grew to the size of trout. And these are by far the commonest fossils, both the otoliths and the tiny vertebrae that fish have, the most common fossils found in the lake. These are their living relatives today, the galaxids, the gobies, and the graylings, or smelt. And all 3 of these are around today, but in slightly smaller forms. We do have native bats in New Zealand, but what we're finding quite a remarkable story about the bats in Lake Manuherikia, or around Lake Manuherikia. Their remains have washed into the lake. They're obviously not living in the lake itself. And one of the most remarkable ones, called Volcanops, there's a suggestion that this may have been secondarily flightless. So when we say giant, it was like this big. It wasn't this big. It was only this big. When we say, but the way that its femur and its leg bones are actually orientated makes us suspect that it could have been secondarily flightless and walked around on the forest floor. And this would have made it the world's only secondarily flightless bat. But of course, being a lake, what we really have the bulk of are ducks. We have we have 11 species of duck now, I think, and two flightless rails. Rails being the relatives of the pukeko today. These are very small but flightless. We have a relative of the dodo. And this, believe it or not, this is a Nicobar pigeon, and this is the closest living relative of the dodo. And our bird is the size of a Nicobar pigeon, so only about this big. Not the dodos were huge; they were like this large. But but it makes sense that we would have had something like a dodo at this time. Because of the fact that dodos are clearly a Gondwanan group, as are the seed snipe and the plains wanderer. The plains wanderer on the left here is a tiny bird only now found in southern western New South Wales. The seed snipes are only found in the Andes, and we had a relative of these, once again one of the true Gondwanan relics. This is also a Gondwanan relic. The bird on the right is a Magellanic plover, now only found in Patagonia. The bird on the left is a sheathbill, only found on several Indian Ocean islands in the sub-Antarctic. And we had a relative of those, clearly a Gondwanan relic. And so, these are building up the picture that we did have a whole lot of relictual Gondwanan animals, but each of these groups is now completely extinct worldwide, and certainly our representatives of each of these relictual groups is extinct on New Zealand. And one of the most famous things was this giant parrot. The media nicknamed Squawkzilla, stood nearly a metre tall, maybe weighing 20-25 kilograms. And this was recently exhibited in the museum's Squawkzilla and the Giants exhibition. And we're placing this in the new museum experience. So this bird was most closely related to the Kia and Kaka, and that's how we've actually reconstructed it in this model. But about 10 to 15 times the size of a Kia or a Kaka. Possibly flightless, we're not entirely sure. And as birds become larger, they become more likely to become carnivorous. So this might have been a flightless carnivorous Kia or Kaka type relative. You can see in the background there some of the other animals that occurred in this lake. This is how an artist's reimagining of what Lake Manuherikia may have looked like. So, we had this large parrot. We also had this tiny bird here, which is most closely related to the New Zealand wrens of today. We called this one Kuiornis, and the best bone that we have of this is about 4 millimetres long. So we have to look, really at the very minutiae of the bones that are actually collected. And the research continues at the site. We've recently published this paper where we basically summarise the complete collections over the last 24, 25 years. And that highlights the fact we've got about 40 different species of bird, the crocodiles, the bats, and all sorts of a flamingo type bird, for example. Really quite a remarkable snapshot into all the animals that lived around this lake, died and fell in. But we've also started looking at some of the groups that we'd put in the too hard basket. So this is a paper we recently brought out looking at the diversity of songbirds. Songbirds are all quite recently evolved, and their bones are incredibly similar. So it really requires some very specialist knowledge to actually understand how a particular bone relates to a living individual. The most remarkable of these is the New Zealand currawong, and this will be coming out probably in the next week or so. So a lot of New Zealand conservationists are very anti-magpie, and that's understandable. I mean, they definitely do affect the flora and fauna of mainly the native fauna. But what's quite surprising is the fact that 16 million years ago we might have had a bird that was actually quite closely related to magpies. The currawongs are magpies' nearest relatives. These are the birds, if you're in the Australian bush, they've got that very sort of horn-like call, a very distinctive call of the Australian bush. Most of them are black. and most of them are sort of magpie-sized, and a very significant part of the Australian bush, and probably would have been a very significant part of the New Zealand fauna as well. We've quite recently looked at the gull-like birds and discovered, using bones like this, that we had a number of birds that were quite closely related to the tropical noddies, but none of the gulls that you actually see today, because that group hadn't actually evolved 16 million years ago. And this was one of the ones that was really perplexing us for many years, as we found these tiny fossils. That's only about 3 or 4 millimeters long. These are the fossils on the bottom row here. And we couldn't quite work out what on earth these things were. But we managed to actually pull apart. We just had a suspicion that they could have been freshwater crayfish, because we didn't have any other freshwater crayfish records from this lake. And we pulled apart the mandibles of freshwater crayfish, and we discovered that there was, a pretty exact match for that. So this is just the piece of the mandible that actually grinds the food up at the front of the freshwater crayfish, and that enabled us to determine that this lake had freshwater crayfish much the size of the Australian yabbies. So I don't know if you're familiar, but we have these quite small New Zealand freshwater crayfish, only about this long. In Australia, they get up to the size that you can see there, and even bigger, and have these very large holes like this. And a feed of yabbies, if you catch a couple of those, it's really quite a decent feed, a bit like the New Zealand marine crayfish. And these would have been quite a significant feature of the lake, but because of the fact that the majority of their carapace doesn't fossilise, it was really difficult to actually determine how common the species was. But now we've established that these mandibles are actually from these freshwater crayfish. We have finally an understanding of some of the invertebrates from our particular site. But there's another site down at Bannockburn that actually does preserve some insects and other things that we actually don't get at our site. And this is an interesting thing about fossil sites, is that one site doesn't preserve all. Sometimes you have to look for a different type of geochemistry to actually to get a fuller picture of what was going on. So Bannockburn is exactly the same, from exactly the same lake system and from exactly the same time period, but for one reason or another, the geochemistry of when these sediments were laid down was subtly different. So here you've got Manuherikia River up there at the top, you've got Alexandra, you've got Hilden Mar, and Bannockburn Inlet is marked there. So that blue area there is a rough extent of the lake, Lake Manuherikia, and Bannockburn, as the crow flies, is only probably 30, 40 kilometres, so potentially just the other side of the same lake. And this is giving us a really good idea of the flora of the area, which is really quite complex and not fully not fully established yet. But the real take home that I wanted to give you here is that although there are features of the New Zealand flora, for example, there are trees like kauri, there's a large number of notophagus, and there are other polycarps. Three of the most numerous fossils from this site are actually from the she oak group, the casuarinas, completely absent from New Zealand, the New Zealand native fauna today, but an absolutely fundamental part of the Australian flora. The eucalyptus was a very abundant species during this period. And the broadleaf laurels, although we do have, especially in the northern forests, things like Bellschmiedia, the tawa, that these were a really abundant part of the flora in the South Island, in the Lake Manuherikia and its surrounds at the time. And the first two, the casuarinas and the eucalypts, have completely vanished. And this is probably due to this, the glaciations that occurred at the end of the Miocene. And the laurel group have been effectively forced north. So most of the laurel group don't occur in the South Island anymore, and some of them are only found in Northland. Probably many hundreds of species became extinct due to that global cooling. But what that's meant is that the New Zealand flora is not this Noah's Ark. It's not, and you know, as you probably all aware, when they film some of these dinosaur programs, they go to the West Coast and they film the New Zealand flora because the New Zealand forest, because it seems to be a very close approximation to what the flora of the Cretaceous, when the dinosaurs were around, actually looked like. And you know, and there's no denying that it is, but it's not necessarily what New Zealand looked like even 15, 20 million years ago. New Zealand may have actually looked more like, you know, northern New South Wales or even Queensland, which is something that, as New Zealanders that are very proud of our flora and fauna, we're a bit shocked to discover that 15, 20 million years ago we might have been more like Australia, and the oddness of the New Zealand flora and fauna today might really just be something that's primarily occurred because of our, you know, what happened in the last 3 or 4 million years, which was this catastrophic series of glacial events. And the flora and fauna, understanding of the fauna is improving with looking at different parts of the fossil record. Some quite exciting work done both looking in the Bannockburn shales and also in amber, or copal as it actually is, from some coal sites around Central Otago, has established species of spider, wasp, and ants and beetles and midges, most of which don't have any close New Zealand relative, and many of which their nearest relatives are from the tropics. So really a very different picture of New Zealand 15, 16 million years ago than David Bellamy would have led you to believe in the 1970s or 1980s. And I'm not disparaging David Bellamy. He did the very best with the evidence that he had in front of him. But unfortunately with science, what happens is that the evidence outweighs the actual stories, and actually gives you a great idea of, a much better idea of what was really going on, which means that you basically have to change your paradigm, change your hypothesis. And that there's another exciting site that's really only just getting started, which is this folded maar. So a maar is a congregation, I guess, a filling of a volcano or any other form of deep lake over a comparatively short period of time. And this maar, which is down sort of inland, coastal North Otago, has effectively a book of layers, very fine layers, some of which are only a few millimeters thick, probably each one representing a year of deposition or even a shorter period of deposition in this very calm and protected lake. And by chipping open these layers of maar or shale, you can find some really quite incredible fossils, for example, almost completely preserved fish, and a huge flora and fauna. And once again, this is giving you a period, an impression of what the flora and fauna and the insects and the fish was like at this period. Unfortunately, as I mentioned with the at Bannockburn, this particular lake doesn't give us any idea of any other vertebrates apart from fish that were actually living in this lake, because the geochemistry at this particular period was really quite different. And you know, as work on this site evolves, we'll get a much better idea of exactly what was happening during this early Miocene period. The one controversial thing about all three sites is exactly how old they are. The Folding Maar, we have a pretty good idea that it was, it clearly happened immediately, or it started filling immediately after the volcano erupted and became dormant, because it basically blew a hole in the landscape, and then water filled and made a lake. So we have a pretty good idea that Folding Maar was about 23 million years old. It's been quite controversial how old St Bathans was, because the flora and fauna are quite different from Folding Maar. And we believe that about 16 million years, maybe it's 20 million years ago. Some people are actually more of the opinion that St Bathans could only be 10 million years ago. There's one very strange thing, that Folding Maar has eels in it, and yet we've got nearly 14,000 fossils of fish from Lake Manuherikia, and it doesn't have eels. So anyway, you'll have to watch this space to firmly get an idea. We're using various geochemical techniques to work out the age of the two sites. So, you know, the whole story isn't over. Takeaway is that New Zealand was a very different place 16 million years ago. So thank you very much.